Hi Booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to have a bit of a ramble about T.S. Eliot. I'm currently in the process of reading some of his poetry as part of a reading group that's, we're all reading some of his major poems at the moment through the month of August. And I thought I'd just take a few minutes just to ramble on a bit about his early poetry, and I think I might try and do this then about The Wasteland kind of being his middle period, and then four quartets for his later period, at least in his poetry. He'd go on after four quartets to focus on his playwriting, and maybe after the end of the month I'll go on and try and actually read more of his drama. I've only read Murder in the Cathedral so far, so I might try and read all of his plays as well before the end of the year. But I want to talk about his early period, about early Eliot, and what I think of the poetry, because I think I've got a bit of a mixed relationship with early T.S. Eliot. There's a brilliance, there's a fair bit of fun and humour in early Eliot, and yet I just can't quite get away from this sense of the poem seeming a bit infantile or a little just a bit silly really in their treatment and in their humour, and so we'll see how it goes. I haven't really thought out where to begin, but I thought, just to give a taste for maybe what I like most in early Eliot, I'd read out one of his poems that's not quite one of the longest. I won't read out all of Prufrock, so I'm going to start off by reading Preludes. So here's Preludes. The winter evening settles down with smell of steaks in passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt-out ends of smoky days, and now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet and newspapers from vacant lots. The showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street a lonely cab horse steams and stamps. And then the lighting of the lamps. The morning comes to consciousness of faint stale smells of beer from the sawdust trampled street, with all its muddy feet that press to early coffee stands. With the other masquerades that time resumes, one thinks of all the hands that are raising dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. You tossed a blanket from the bed. You lay upon your back and waited. You dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. They flickered against the ceiling. And when all the world came back and the light crept up between the shutters and you heard the sparrows in the gutters, you had such a vision of the street as the street hardly understands. Sitting along the bed's edge where you curled the papers from your hair or clasped the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. His soul stretched tight across the skies that fade behind a city block, or trampled by insistent feet at 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock, and short square fingers stuffing pipes, and evening newspapers, and eyes assured of certain certainties, the conscience of a blackened street, impatient to assume the world. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling. The notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. Wipe your hand across your mouth and laugh. The worlds revolve like ancient women gathering fuel in vacant lots. So that's Preludes. One of my favourite T.S. Eliot poems, and maybe actually my favourite poem from this early period. It's from his first collection, Prufrock and Other Observations. And as you can tell, the style is very observational. It's all details, all there's a lot of atmosphere in there as well. And I think one of the telltale things from early Eliot, and there are still traces of it all the way through his career, is his fascination with urban landscapes. I seem to remember reading some probably in Ackroyd's biography of Eliot, that poets like Baudelaire were a huge influence, if only for the way that they took what was for them the modern urban landscape around them as the subject for their poetry, rather than romantic ideals of mountaintops and forests and waterfalls, or the rolling hills of pastoral poetry. Instead, it's dirty, dingy city streets, and we have in there, the smell of steaks in passageways, the grimy scraps, the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, and newspapers from vacant lots. We have the shutters and the blinds from windows, the people looking in and out, filling their pipes. We have the busy, insistent feet getting from A to B, and so that busy urban life is part of what's represented here, but is not necessarily the sort of kernel, the thing that Eliot seems to be getting at. And it's something that I think what he's getting at, that it's something that's always underneath a lot of his poetry, and seems, I don't know, there's an odd quality to it in his early poetry. Maybe I'll start just actually talking about it to give you an idea of what I actually mean. But it's Pound's relationship, I suppose, or his attitude towards sexuality of any kind. And I think he just found the whole idea of it quite distasteful in one way, and yet he was also kind of obsessed with it as well. He was writing some very, very sordid poems. There's the prose poem in this collection called Hysteria, which is about the speaker of the poem sitting in a restaurant, seeing a woman laughing and watching her breasts moving as she's laughing, and that's the poem. And there's this simultaneous obsession and disgust with any kind of sexuality, and some of the unpublished stuff that he would write would be even more on the nose, and felt like a kind of purging, and maybe this was why in later life he would rely so much on his Anglicanism and stuff. He had this, again, I don't know how to describe it, but it's a very aesthetic sensibility, where he almost, kind of in a spiritual and emotional way, had to kind of punish himself in some way. And I think it might be that his attitude to sex is, I don't know, somewhere in there. But anyway, he's uncomfortable about sex, even even when he's married. Uncomfortable about his friends, in the Bloomsbury set and such. talking freely about their affairs. And I think it's in here. There are sordid details in here, suggestive details of some kind of sexual encounter going on in here. In section 3 of the poem, of presumably we're looking over the shoulder of a female character, and it's suggestive that she's just slept with someone in a room, with this whole street scene going on unawares outside. And whenever these details come up that are suggestive, there's always a trace of disgust in the language. So the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. And that coming straight off, you dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images. And so it isn't you dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images of, and then, whatever took place or whatever has been maybe related to you from someone. But the fact that this perversion is is the essence of a person, I think is a way of Eliot expressing his mistrust and disgust with sex. And what was the other bit? Yeah, the bit towards the end, just this bit: you curled the papers from your hair, or clasped the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. And so again, this quite sort of striking, dirty language that just, again, doesn't suggest someone who's at peace with the subject matter, or has issue with the subject matter. And yet, why is he bringing it up? Why is he writing it about it? Is he trying to get something out? Yeah. Anyway, and so that's something in there, and it goes on from there into later poems, like in the Sweeney poems, and there are quite a few situations where you get there and kind of realise that it's a kind of post-coital poem, particularly Sweeney Erect. I think that's the one where, if it's not this one, it's one of the others. Maybe it's Sweeney Among the Nightingales, where Sweeney's just shaving after having sex with this woman who is having a fit on the bed after the encounter, and he's just shaving, and it's this sort of weird, absurd, quite disturbing look at how people treat each other, and of his attitudes towards sex. So that's sort of that element that seems to be in there, and this feeling of disturbance always strikes me as being a little too close to the surface in these early poems. It's as if it's just a little too raw, and he can't quite bring himself to hone it in quite the right way that in later poetry I think he does. I think in The Wasteland it's very, very suggestive of sexual encounters in certain passages, and it's very, very clear that he has a longing to be to sort of just to transcend the world, that the world is too much, whether due to sex, what's maybe expected of him, or what other people are doing, and he just finds it too much, or whether it's just the world in general. I think he was a very hypersensitive person. He could get overwhelmed quite quickly and internalize a lot of things, and he just wants to transcend and get all just get out of it. And that's expressed sort of wonderfully in The Wasteland. But he hasn't got there yet. And I think that's the frustration I often feel with the early poetry is, the way in which he isn't quite at peace, isn't quite confident enough to deal with the subject matter he's trying to deal with. That's at least something that I feel. What else do I think of T.S. Eliot's early poetry? In terms of form and how T.S. Eliot writes, one of the big things that people bring up is his utilisation of free verse. As far as I can tell, he certainly wasn't the first poet, well, he definitely wasn't the first poet in English to be doing it. And certainly the modernists, I think, were relatively late to the party in terms of free verse. I think, certainly in English, some late Victorian poets were playing with it. Some of the decadents certainly must have been playing with it. And the term free verse is a translation of vers libre, or however you pronounce it, in French, and it was, it had been around for at least 50, 60 years before proof rock and before Eliot and Pound and HD, and so I suppose it was still relatively new in terms of an established idea of what poetry could be. It was maybe looked down upon by the establishment, but I try not to big up the idea that it was an explosion in terms of form. And as you hear in preludes, that there's a lot of rhyming going on, and a lot of a lot of formal elements being utilised in there. The same with proof rock. It starts off with a sonnet. Really, the first section of proof rock is, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And so it's not a sort of perfect sonnet, and maybe some people wouldn't even dare call it a sonnet, but I seem to recognise that as at least a nod to the sonnet, and then the last two lines are a kind of refrain throughout the poem. But certainly the couplets appear all the way through. That rhyme pattern of couplets is not all the way through the poem, but it's in there. And sometimes I do find T.S. Eliot's, I think it's one of the other things I sometimes find a little annoying in his poetry, and in his early poetry, is the very on the nose rhyming, as well. The sort of overly, it feels like over rhyming sometimes. Particularly, there's a bit in Proof Rock that always, so I've seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I've seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short, I was afraid. And the actual idea of what's being said there, I like a lot. I do like the sentiment of those lines, but it just feels a bit over the top as well, with a bit earlier on. And indeed, there will be time to wonder Do I dare, and do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. Um, and again, I think the point of it is to be a little over the top and mischievous, and to be a little silly, a little bit of that slightly, not completely infantile humour, but it certainly feels like, it does feel like that a bit. But I actually may have got from the first lines of Proof Rock. What stays with me, the kind of taste that's left in my mouth, is just the whole mood of it. Is this urban landscape, that's often quite dirty, reflective and suggestive of lives that, for whatever reason, whether it's to do with sex or whether to do it with anything else, to do with just the alienation of urban life, people who feel a certain amount of disgust or at least discomfort with their lot. And so it's certainly there in Proof Rock and in Preludes. On to a little bit later, just to quickly address his poems of 1920, so some slightly later poems between Proof Rock and The Wasteland. And these poems, to me, feel a little more, just a little bit more like he's under Ezra Pound's wing a little bit. That he's sort of trying to be Ezra Pound a little in certainly the first couple of poems in Gerontion and in Burbank with a Baedeker, Blindstein with a cigar. Two poems that are a little bit infamous. I think the second more so, for well, the first one for anti-Semitic connotations, the second for full-on anti-Semitism. And again, I'm not sure to what extent that was through Pound's influence. I'm not sure. It's probably a bit too early on, maybe for it to be too much of an obsession on Pound's part. But I may be wrong. He may have been virulently anti-Semitic throughout his life. But there's certainly a culture of anti-Semitism that they were both party to and had both grown up in. So it's hardly surprising to see it. But in Gerontion we have, essentially it's just a kind of typecast character of a Jewish landlord, and then there are just some rather ugly inferences, just some lines really that are just clearly quite anti-Semitic, if I can find them. So yeah, where shall I start? A lustreless, protrusive eye stares from the protozoic slime as a perspective of Canaletto. The smoky candle end of time declines. On the Rialto, once, the rats are underneath the piles. The Jew is underneath the lot. Money in furs. And so there's that. It's, I feel quite uncomfortable reading it. I as I was saying it out loud, wondering whether I really wanted to include this in the video. But I mean, even earlier on, a lustreless, protrusive eye stares from the protozoic slime, which is, again, just sort of just saying that this character is literally subhuman, and then again this motif that's brought up eventually by the Nazis of images of rats and then of Jews, and so yeah, that leaves a sour taste in one's mouth. And as far as I can as far as I can work out, Pound he never openly um, recounted or apologised for his anti-Semitism. I don't know to what extent it would have been common for people to do that during his lifetime, but I do know of a period where a poet whose name is mistaking me. I might just try and go and find his name and share with you the poem before I carry on with the story. So the poet in question is Emanuel Litvinov, and the story goes. I think I saw it in a documentary, and it was from Litvinov's own mouth. But Litvinov wrote a poem called to T.S. Eliot, and he just takes T.S. Eliot to task on particularly Boudicca on this poem, the second poem, and he just a little bit into the poem says, "I am not one accepted in your parish. Blindstein is my relative, and I share the protozoic slime of Shylock, a page in Sturma, and underneath the cities, a billet somewhere lower than the rats, blood in the sewers, pieces of our flesh float with the odour, with the odour on the vistula. You had a sermon, but it was not this." I believe it was written after the Second World War, and it sort of goes on into sort of how can we carry on including this poem in poetry anthologies and stuff post World War II when other Jews have been murdered, that their blood is flowing or has been soaked into the soil of a continent. He finishes off with so shall I say it is not eminence so shall I say it is not eminence chills, but the snigger from behind the covers of history. Let your words tread lightly on this earth of Europe, lest my people's bones protest. So very, very on the nose. And the story goes that he read the whole poem at a poetry reading where T.S. Eliot was present, and it was a bit dramatic, I suppose, and a lot of people were trying to either to get him to stop or trying to be like, how can you say that about T.S. Eliot? And it was later on, I think, in T.S. Eliot's life, and I think someone sat in front of T.S. Eliot sort of going on, and T.S. Eliot just sort of pokes forward and pokes the person on the shoulder and whatever, and tells them to quiet down and to say, no, it's a good poem, and that was all he said about it, was that it was a good poem, who knows, and certainly after that poem, as far as I can tell, as far as I can remember, nothing like that is said again, and so it does seem like even before this point, before this story of him hearing this poem, long before then, it seems like the anti-Semitism cooled down, and so again, I don't know why I've gone on this ramble about T.S. Eliot's anti-Semitism, or the anti-Semitism expressed in that poem, but it is just one of the many things that I just often feel a little jarred by in T.S. Eliot's early poetry, and is at least worth discussing and pointing out for anyone wanting to delve a little bit deeper. And I'll leave Litvinov's poem, if I can find it online. I'll pop it underneath in the description. And I think that's everything. So I'll leave it there. I hope you got at least a glimmer of how I feel about T.S. Eliot. As I said, when it comes to his early poetry, it's a bit of a love-hate relationship. In many ways, I love proof rock. I love preludes, portrait of a lady. I kind of like the hippopotamus, which is one of his quatrain poems. Still a period I don't particularly love, but there's something about that poem that I find quite funny. But as soon as we get onto the wasteland, and as soon as we get onto four quartets, it just feels like it's almost a completely different poet. It's just so much better, in my humble opinion. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.